I was a public delegate to the 57th General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, for someone from Orlando, Florida, that was pretty exciting. I sat there in the chair of the United States and voted on behalf of the United States. The United States delegation has 10 delegates. It's 5 ambassadors, a representative, a senator, and 3 lay people. And the U.S. has decided that their delegation, they're going to place 3 public delegates or people from all walks of life that will come and assist and be part of the delegation. And so the United Nations building across from it is the U.S. building, and the U.S. building is run like an embassy and has probably 250, almost 300 employees. But the 10 people that actually get to vote and sit at the chair are the public delegates, the ambassadors, and the 2 senator and representatives. So I had the pleasure of doing that, and it was very exciting. It's a very exciting time in the world history to be there during the entire Iraqi situation. And so it was very exciting for me to be there, sitting in the chair on the floor of the United States when the president gave the Iraqi speech, and 191 countries, 6 to every delegation, and you could hear a pin drop in that whole auditorium. It was very, very fascinating. And then that night, I got to go to a reception where 89 heads of state were in, and we were invited as part of the U.S. delegation. And so in a room about the size of this, we sat with 89 heads of state. And it gave me an opportunity to just talk to different people about the interest in their countries and what their whole life is about, and just to even see how foreign heads of state dress. And that was very interesting. Got to talk to Ahmed Karzai from Afghanistan, who had just had an attempt in his life 4 days before, and was very much, talking about those issues and how he was going to put all the tribes together and explain to me how he was going to do it. And certainly they have a plan, and I think Afghanistan is on its way to success. As a public delegate, though, I got an opportunity to look at the UN from the outside. As an outsider, sit there for 4 months and then exit. The appointment was for a year, but really the General Assembly sits for 4 months, and so September, October, November, December is when I was up there actively voting and doing things like that. I should almost give you an aside. I was born in Cuba, and I came to the U.S. as a refugee. So for me, it was doubly exciting to be able to sit at the U.S. chair, and they deferred to me and allowed me to sit in the chair as the #1 spot. Every time Cuba spoke in the event that they berated the United States, we were ready to walk out. We never had to do that, but it was exciting a couple of times to debate the Cuban foreign minister on issues related to human rights and the various issues that relate to Cuba. But we're here to talk about the UN today, and I hope that some of the areas that I share with you will spark some good questions. And so let me give you a few topics to talk about. First of all, the overall impression of the UN is best conveyed by an insight from Jean Kirkpatrick, a former U.S. permanent representative to the UN, which he said, "The UN is not in any sense what the founders had intended or expected it to be. It is in no sense a utopian arena where nations seek dispassionately, objectively to solve problems. It is instead a place where a very hard game of politics is played, whose outcome depends less on the merits of the issues than on the relative power of the players within the UN system." And that's a great quote, because certainly the goals of the UN are stated in the Charter, but it's like watching make sausage. What comes out may not necessarily be what you expected when it first goes in. The UN is indeed one of several organizations that we have that pursue enlargement of democracy, human rights, and counterterrorism, and things of that nature. But we cannot have too high expectations from the UN based on the current forum and the way that our voting practices are. Basically, the deck is slightly stacked against the United States, and we have to accept that, and we have to accept the results of the votes based on that. In order for us to have a more perfect United Nations, I think a reduction of the leverage that the tiny countries have has to be obtained. I think that some of the repressive regimes also band together and give us a very difficult time when we're trying to expand democracy and expand fundamental human rights. During the Cold War, we had two black and white issues. You're either for the West or you were for the East. And so we bargained with countries and pulled and tugged to be able to get certain countries in our bloc, and the Soviet Union was trying to get folks in their bloc. And so there were two blocs. And it was very easy because whenever we needed a vote, we could call in our friends that were democratic versus the friends that the Russians had that were communist. And so the voting went very well. What we have today, since the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the East and West blocs, we now have alliances that have been formed. And you have the African alliance, and you have the Asian, I guess they call them blocs, but the Asian, the Africans. You have the Pan-American bloc, and the European Union. And so you have all these little blocs that have formed around for interest economically, and then you have another set of blocs that have formed for political interest, and that being the non-aligned group. You've got the Group of 57, the G57. And so what you have now is different interest groups blocking together in votes and leaving basically the United States out there to squirm around and try to find allies on certain issues. Oftentimes, in some resolutions, they'll put in a budgetary issue into a resolution that we're interested in, expanding the budget, and so we vote against that because we are very frugal. And so that we lose that vote. They'll put something about Israel in one of the resolutions, and we'll have to vote against it. And so we find ourselves very often that out of the 191 votes that we have to get for a total United Nations, big blocks of votes are already assigned. Like the G57 is 57 countries that have allied together and let one country speak for them, in this case being Cuba. We have the non-aligned movement. It's a 131 group of countries. And then you've got, like I said, the different regional groups. And so that presents a real problem for us. But when you consider that in the entire General Assembly, each country has one vote. And you're talking about St. Kitts, Nevis, with population of 39,000, having an equal vote to the United States. St. Lucia, 49,000 inhabitants, same vote as the United States. And so you've got this year, the President of the United Nations is from St. Lucia, and that gives a lot of power to a country. The country of Nauru has 12,000 inhabitants, and they have an equal vote to the United States, to France, to Germany, and to any of the industrialized countries. So what we have is sort of a lopsided situation since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and something that we can talk about a little more. Now, the UN system has given rise to an array of very effective programs in the area of health, in the area of education, refugee, and sustainable development. And so, oftentimes where speakers say, do we need the UN? Well, I think we need the UN, but I think the UN needs reform. And I think there's a lot of things that can be done today to be able to reform the UN. I don't necessarily have the answer, so when you all start asking questions, I've got just a couple of ideas on that. But in the political sense, the United Nations went into East Timor. And East Timor is a country that was a Portuguese colony that Indonesia took over. Genocide, the UN stepped in, and the UN has now developed a free democratic government in East Timor, and it's a real feather in the UN's cap, and they just joined the UN last year as the 190th, Switzerland being the 191st. Switzerland just joined the UN last year. In the economic arena, we have a problem in that we pay 22% of the budget of the United Nations. A country like St. Lucia, the president of the United Nations this year, they pay to the UN budget 0.00002. And so when it comes to budgetary matters, you can imagine that if you're paying 22% and they're paying 0.00002, there's a real problem as someone tries to increase the budget and the U.S. is trying to hold it down. And so, just to give you an example, the UK pays 6.5, France pays 5.6, and we pay 22%. And what happens oftentimes is that we may be lobbying a country to try to help us. How am I doing for time, by the way? Am I taking too long?
Actually, you have another 5 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. This is great. I'm a lawyer, and then we get a little carried away when you give me a microphone. And my brother's a politician, so that's the bad combination. At any rate, where was okay? So when you get into the budgetary matters, there's a tug of war because the little countries, they want more money and they want more programs and they want more of this and that. The U.S. is pulling back and saying, "Look, we can't afford it," and so that's a real problem for the U.S. in the UN. That is budget. What I was getting to is, oftentimes countries will come up to us and say, "We'd love to be on your side, but France, for instance, they help us a lot with this project and this building and that building. What about you guys?" And so our response has to be, look, France is giving you 5.6. Do you get any UN aid? Oh, well, we get a lot of UN aid, but we're not getting any from the U.S. I said, well, I'm getting a lot from France and England. I said, yeah, but remember, the U.S. is giving 22% to the budget. So if you're getting UN, you're getting 22% from us. The fact that France is giving you direct assistance, figure it out because they're only paying 5.6. And so constantly we have this debate of a tug of war of money and aid and how that applies. One of the problems that the UN has is that they do not have a sunset provision for many of their commissions. Like, for instance, we still have a commission on decolonization. Decolonization was very big in the 60s when all the Portuguese, German, French, Spanish colonies were being decolonized and new governments were being taken over, particularly in Africa. Well, that commission is still going, and it's huge, and there are people working on it, and reports being issued. And technically, Puerto Rico and Guam are the only two countries that are supposed to still be colonies, and I'm not sure of any other one that I was able to detect over there. But that's what this decolonization commission, meets about and writes reports year after year after year. It's all about Puerto Rico and Guam. So those are areas that the sunset provisions ought to be put into the United Nations to try to phase out some programs and things of that nature. Human Rights Commission, that's another area that we've had some problems. The word got out that to the bad boys, to the bad folks, that the human rights violators, that if you get yourself in the Human Rights Commission, then you can block anything against you. And so sure enough, now the chair of the Human Rights Commission currently is Libya. Cuba is in there, Sudan, China, etc., Iran. And so all these human rights, what we would consider in our country human rights violators, have gotten themselves in the Human Rights Commission to be able to fend off anything or any resolutions against them. And so that's a problem, and I'm not sure how that can be solved, but that's an area that is losing a little bit of credibility right now when you have Libya be the president of the Commission on Human Rights. The fact that we don't have any teeth in human rights is also a problem. Commissioner de Mello, who was just killed in Iraq in a bomb, he was our High Commissioner of Human Rights, and he appointed a human rights commissioner from France, for instance, to go to Cuba and investigate human rights violation there. Cuba said, no, you can't come in, and that's the end of that. The UN couldn't do anything further, and so no one has gone over there to issue a report on human rights violation, even though in Geneva we voted that that be done. All right, I think I'm running out of time, but I'll be happy to answer questions. Let me just say this. Do we need the UN? I think so. Does it need reforms? Yes, I think so. Thanks.
What I'm going to be talking about, I've been asked to speak about the UN and its role in both Afghanistan and Iraq. However, today I'd like to step back from Iraq, since most of the discussion seems to be on that, and I'll just focus on the forgotten reconstruction country, and that being Afghanistan. So that's where I'll be focusing on today. And I'd like to thank my daughter, Erin, who just showed up and is going to operate the laptop for me. So thank you, Erin. Let's go forward if we can. Try the other one. Try the other button there. Bingo. Okay, great. We've got a lot to talk about. I'll try to be brief on each subject and allow as much time as possible to Q&A later. But clearly I could speak for a long time. Afghanistan is near and dear to my heart. I love the Afghan people, and I'm doing whatever I can to help them in the rebuilding of their country. We'll be talking about these subjects today. I'll tell you a little very quickly about what Fideligent is all about. And again, I thank the Lou Frey Institute for starting to bring business people in. I'm not a politician. I don't teach political science anywhere, but I can tell you what business life is like in Afghanistan for sure. So we'll cover these subjects. Next slide, please. People always ask me, what is Fideligent? Well, it comes from two Latin roots, one for fidelity, trust, and the other intelligence. So trust and knowledge is the slogan, the motto of our company, and it's one that we believe in very strongly. We are, as the primary mission shows, an international business trading company. It's our job to bring together parties, both exporters and importers, and get business created. We do that because we have what we think is one of the strongest talent bases of Afghan and other kinds of expertise available in the United States. We'll get into some of that in detail. Next slide. I have been honored in the last 2 years to be asked by the Afghan government directly to come to Afghanistan and help with the rebuilding of their country. I have been there. Many of my staff are constantly going back and forth, helping the various ministries, working in both a private investment and a government contract role. Yes. Right now we have a number of projects ongoing. Most of these have been driven by the paucity of government contract work in the last year, but all of a sudden the floodgates are open. We now have been called upon to fulfill a number of large government contracts. I've listed only some of them here. One of the most exciting is up front. We've been asked to establish a bank system in Afghanistan that will underpin the substantial redevelopment and rebuilding of many sectors, including agriculture, mining, etc. Other contracts we're working on are shown here. We have been preparing for over a year to do this. We have been working with local and state and international businesses, and universities have joined our team to compete for and execute some of these contracts for the U.S. in rebuilding Afghanistan. Hard to see, but basically we have 8 subsidiaries. The aviation subsidiary, the 9th, is in work. We have over 110 top experts spread out among this group, and as my later chart will show, in the next 9 months we should be over 1,000 employee base at our current growth rate. Next. This is the team. If you end up calling the office, feel free to do so. But again, it's an international group. Mr. Hemphill and Mr. Keene are my right and left arms, respectively. Mr. Keene is the overall head of all construction activity, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's one of the world's best. He's built Saudi palaces, major highways, dams, you name it, around the world. We're very honored to have John with us. Why Fideligent? Why not IBM, or someone mentioned Bechtel earlier? Well, it's because we know more about Afghanistan than any other U.S. business. It's that simple. We've spent the last 2 years building that capability. We do have more expertise in more business areas than any other U.S. company. Our experts are constantly working with the various ministries, from banking and finance to agriculture to construction. We're working on, again, private projects which include emerald mining, copper mining, gold mining, as well as government contract work. I'd also like to focus on, however, the last bullet on this slide. We're very dedicated to humanitarian work in Afghanistan, and very proud of some of the work that we've done in the Afghan Women and Children Fund. And please go to awacf.org when you get a chance. There's a lot more there to it. Thank you. American foreign policy, be it U.S. or UN in Afghanistan, cannot be viewed in isolation. It must be viewed in terms of the total context of Central Asian policy. It is highly unlikely that anyone that tells you this is the way the policy is in Afghanistan and says so only about Afghanistan doesn't know what they're saying. We don't make decisions about Afghanistan without considering all of its 6 major nation border states and nations. By the way, it's hard to see, but off to the very far right where that little burgundy appendage sticks out from Afghanistan, that touches China. China is a border nation and a very important future nation to Afghanistan. So when we talk about UN and U.S. policy in Afghanistan, it's really in the context of Central Asian policy. And decisions that appear unusual for Afghanistan are often because of that context. This is perhaps one of my most favorite slides, and let me speak briefly about it. It's difficult to talk about socioeconomic and geopolitical aspects of Afghanistan without understanding that over half the country is over 2,000 meters high. Kabul is like Denver. It is a mile-high city. The central highlands and the northeastern quadrant of this photo, the Hindu Kush, are some of the tallest mountain ranges on the planet. So everything about it, including designing buildings for earthquakes, must be viewed in the context of the geology of this country. Also, slicing through the middle, if you can see that, is a major valley system. This valley system is called the Panjshir Valley. It is one of the richest valleys on this planet in terms of natural wealth, and it is the future of Afghanistan's economy, in my opinion. Yes. Historically, we could go back to the days of Alexander the Great, who came through, who staked his tent in Chadikar, a town just north of Kabul, and began doing emerald mining way back when. But to bring things more into focus, let me start off with the great game, which was the competition between Russia and Great Britain during the 1800s, 17 and 1800s, where Afghanistan basically was a pawn in that great political and military scene at that time. Speeding forward, King Zahir Shah created a very stable and progressive government, but unfortunately his cousin kicked him out of office in 1973. There's a great story behind that, but to be brief, King returned. His cousin was executed later. Descent into chaos. Well, basically when you dethrone a monarch by force or evict him otherwise, oftentimes it creates instability, and that was the crux. That was the salt and the seed in the solution that in fact led to 23, now 24 years of civil war in Afghanistan. And ultimately, the Russians came in during that chaotic period from 79 to 89. They were kicked out by the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters of Afghanistan that banded together. And then, because the Mujahideen couldn't stop fighting with one another, things got much worse, and then the Taliban came in. The Taliban initially were viewed as saviors, eliminating the civil war, bringing peace, and hopefully prosperity back to their country. But unfortunately, the Taliban went the way of the other military and political factions and became more of an enemy to the country than a savior. As we all know, 9/11 happened. We knew, I think in advance, that there was a real possibility of attack from al-Qaeda, which had taken up a home in Afghanistan under the protection of Mullah Omar and the Taliban. And of course, after 9/11, we sent in troops and bombers and did our thing. There is, however, a new Afghanistan that was formed, one that is going through a cycle of ups and downs, of political and military turmoil, but one that I think has a great future in front of it. When we came in, we joined with what was called the Northern Alliance. It was a group of fighters who were against the Taliban and was literally stationed in the northern sector of the country. It was basically the Taliban had taken over much of Afghanistan, so what was left were a few enclaves of resistance in the north. With U.S. help from B-52 bombers, we put in a couple thousand troops right away as well, plus many, many covert operative teams. Finally, the Taliban were defeated. Kabul was retaken by the Northern Alliance, and we now have the situation we have. Of course, the Taliban were disbanded and ran off to various parts of the world, but they are now back, and we'll talk about that some as well. Okay, the UN, that is the subject of our presentation. Where did the UN come into play? Actually, the UN was in Afghanistan for 20 years before 9/11. It has a long established history of caring for the Afghan people, and many, many tens of thousands of Afghans owed their lives to the United Nations support. Now, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of that support, but the UN is well entrenched in the history of Afghanistan and caring for its people. certainly back to the 80s. The UN, however, did a number of fundamental policy decisions, made a few fundamental policy decisions, and brought in to lead it a gentleman by the name of Lakhdar Brahimi. Ambassador Brahimi is Moroccan, a well-known UN ambassador who had done many things for the UN. He is leading the UN's effort in Afghanistan. But it took more than one man. And in fact, what happened in November of 2001 was a group of the Northern Alliance and other political factions gathered in Bonn, West Germany, and concluded the so-called Bonn Agreement, which led to the creation of the new Afghan government shortly thereafter. But no government can be recreated, no country can be rebuilt without funds. The Tokyo Conference in January of 2002 brought forth commitments of $4.5 billion to rebuild Afghanistan. The U.S., of course, led the way in that regard. So what is the UN doing now? Well, through its many, many agencies, the UN is doing everything it can for Afghanistan and has been for the last 2 years. I've only listed some of the agencies here, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically these are some of the areas that they're working on. In the process, however, they've brought in over 100 charities and non-governmental organizations to help execute a lot of the support for rebuilding Afghanistan. How much longer do I have, sir?
3-4 minutes.
Okay. Just a photo of some Afghans tearing a wall down in the UN's Work for Food program. Next slide. Where is it now? Well, with the new transitional Islamic government, we see new elections coming, we see a new constitution, hopefully in December, and a new reconstruction program and new funding commitments, a very new important phase for Afghanistan. Unfortunately, however, warlords and bandits reign supreme in virtually all areas of Afghanistan. Still a big problem. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are back in numbers, fighting pitched battles virtually every day. So that situation has gotten worse. Large province and district sectors of the south and east of Afghanistan are no longer under UN or U.S. control. U.S. forces and new aid, again, $1.2 billion has now been promised. We're trying to get that doubled by other donor nations. And NATO is now indicating that they're planning to expand security outside of Kabul and put in large numbers of troops, possibly even replacing the U.S. Photo of the king. I'll move quickly through this. Next slide. General Fahim, one of the key leaders. We can talk about that later. You think your university needs to be rebuilt. This is one dorm. In fact, the gentleman who was my guide told me he lived in that dorm when he went to Kabul. Yes, next slide. This is the way Western Kabul looks. Virtually Dresden, World War II, totally demolished. Next slide. There I am at a local school holding a child in the background. Those are cannon, artillery, and small arms fire holes in the school. Next. So, what's the status on the UN? Well, in order to keep with my schedule here, let me sum it up by going to the bottom line. The UN has literally saved millions of Afghans their lives. As many as 7.5 million Afghans would not be here today, would not be working or trying to work in Afghanistan without the UN. We're currently seeing almost 1 million still dependent on food aid and medical care. The UN had maintained 300 refugee camps in Pakistan during the period of chaos. The UN has done great things. Obviously, could it do more and better? Certainly. And we've had some lessons learned from that as well. Unfortunately, there are a lot of difficulties that have occurred. I've listed some of those there. I'll be glad to go into them in detail. Next slide. I developed for your consideration 3 scenarios for the future. I'll allow you to look at that for a moment, but I think we're on the cusp of major change. I think we're either at a number 2 or 3 right now, but we can turn this around very quickly. The U.S. government has recommitted itself to do so. I think we can go from number 2 to number one fairly soon. Next slide. So there we are. Fideligent Corporation, very active in Afghanistan, a very capable company, and doing whatever we can to help with stability and peace in Central Asia. Next slide. Thank you.
In a recent Foreign Policy magazine article, former U.S. Secretary of State and former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, responded to, in her view, several criticisms of the United Nations. Although Secretary Albright did not phrase it exactly this way, I think she was attempting to address three primary questions about the current state of the UN. First, in the wake of United States actions in the war in Iraq, is the UN still important? To put it a bit more bluntly, is the UN still relevant in the world in which we find ourselves today? Second, what are the primary sources of contention between the United States and the United Nations, and just how problematic has this relationship become? Third, moving beyond the US-UN relationship, what other aspects of the United Nations have been subject to criticism, and just how warranted are these criticisms? Since the creation of the United Nations in the wake of World War I and II, other scholars and policymakers have attempted to address exactly these three questions, and we keep coming back to these questions again and again as the decades unfold. In addition to the views of Secretary Albright, I draw upon three other individuals in particular for my comments today. Current UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick, and former Prime Minister of Sweden, Ingvar Carlsson. First of all, to answer the first question, or attempt to do so, Secretary Albright and numerous others have argued that in the wake of the war in Iraq, and I guess to say wake is a bit erroneous because it's still ongoing, the UN is just not all that relevant anymore. The U.S. went to the UN to request a second resolution. We didn't get that second resolution, and yet we went to Iraq anyway. And people have suggested that this means that the UN is irrelevant. Secretary of State Albright responded to that criticism by saying, no, that's not the case at all. The very fact that President Bush went to the UN in the first place means that it's still relevant, still important. And the fact that he was back just this past week also means that the UN is still relevant, still important. And I have to say that I find that, in all due respect to Madeleine Albright, a woman who I much admire, I find that sort of a weak point. Because the fact that he did go, our president, and the fact that he went back shouldn't be considered unusual if the UN is doing what many of us think it purports to do. And the very fact that much needs to be made of his going in the first place and his going back this past week is not necessarily strong support for the importance or the relevance of that international body. Another point made by Secretary Albright and numerous others is that the UN has many, many programs around the world. And these programs do all sorts of wonderful things for economic and social affairs. They aid in sustainable development, they take care of the environment, they promote health, education, other good economic and social policies. And that's all very, very true. But I'd like you all to think about this. Does the average American, or even the average citizen in any part of the developed, not developing, but the developed world, know about these programs? Do you yourselves know about these programs? Do you understand the reasons for these programs, why monies are expended on these programs, the consequences of not having these programs? And if the answer to many of those questions, for not just those of us here in this room, but for the quote-unquote average citizen in the developed world is, as my students would say, not so much, then I wonder if persons who support the UN and its goals and its programs, among them Madeleine Albright herself, haven't done a particularly good job in educating all of us about the value of that institution. And if we don't understand its value, then of course we're going to question its importance and its relevance. Okay. Moving on to the second question about the contention between the U.S. and the United Nations. One of the things that Secretary Albright and other respondents to these criticisms have said is that things were much worse in the past. During the McCarthyism era, during the 1970s and 80s, during the early 90s when the U.S. was refusing to pay its dues, 22% of the UN budget was just sort of gone because we just weren't paying, kind of as if all of you had gone on tuition strike. What would the university do, right? I'm not suggesting that. I'm not sure that things were worse historically is a particularly good way to respond to, gosh, things are pretty bad today. Okay? Just because it was worse in the past doesn't make me feel confident about the future of U.S.-UN relations. Okay? One of the other responses to this criticism offered by Secretary Albright and others is that the relationship's not actually all that bad. In fact, the American public, when polled, still says that we should use the UN, we should go to the UN. We're paying our dues. We haven't stopped paying our dues in a while, which is good. And that the UN is actually starting to take initiative on programs that are not part of the UN Charter, but that are sort of deeply held policy preferences of the United States, specifically democratic transitions, humanitarian intervention, and anti-terrorism policies. Okay, maybe Secretary Albright and others have something there. It could be that perhaps things are improving. But again, I ask, what's the perception of the average American? What's the perception of the average citizen in the developed world? Is that the perception? Do you all know about those other areas in which the U.S. and the UN fundamentally agree? Or do you know much more about recent events where we've gone to the UN and things have not gone so well? I suggest it's the latter. And I suggest that people who want to defend the United Nations need to do a better job of explaining those areas of agreement and spend less time perhaps talking about those areas of disagreement. I think in the interest of time I will skip the next two sections, but during the question and answer session, if someone would sort of like to ask me, hint, hint, about how the UN Charter and the Bush Doctrine in some people's minds are fundamentally different ways of running the world, or not, I'd be happy to answer questions about that. And I guess I would conclude this question with the notion that some critics have said that the UN is not really a threat to U.S. sovereignty. It's not this battle between the U.S. and the UN. In fact, the UN, these defenders of the UN say, really can't do much at all without the United States. I'm not so sure that's a good way to defend the UN. It can't do very much without the U.S. We have veto power, we don't control, but we certainly contribute 22% of the budget. It seems to me that arguing that an international entity can't do much without you is a sign of that international entity's weakness rather than a sign of its strength. Many critics have noted that the UN has failed in peacemaking. And the respondents to these criticisms say, no, 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 there's a distinction between peacekeeping and peacemaking. And keeping the peace, preventing two sides that were formerly shooting at one another or dropping bombs on one another from continuing to do likewise, is very different than nation building, going in and reconstructing societies, economies, polities that have been torn apart by civil war or interstate war. And that's fine, and I think it's a good and important distinction to make. The problem is that sometimes the UN hasn't been sure whether it should be engaging in peacekeeping or peacemaking. And when it sort of crossed the line towards peacemaking, that's when it's found itself open to lots of criticism. Lots of criticism. And the UN has responded, well, we sort of need to deal with problems earlier on. Right? We need to deal with the root causes of these conflicts. We need to address economic development and illegal arms sales. We need to prosecute war criminals. And all those things are true, but sort of hindsight is 20/20 sometimes, isn't it? Many people have talked about the ineffectiveness of the UN Security Council, and there have been numerous papers from both policymakers and academics alike about how we should reform the United Nations. And like a lot of things, there's been an awful lot of talk, but precious little action in terms of reforming the UN. There's been quite a bit of criticism about the problematic norms of behavior at the UN that hamper both crisis decision-making and day-to-day functioning. The UN civil service is not necessarily a meritocracy, and oftentimes UN committee membership and chairpersons are chosen on rotating and regional bases that may have very little to do with those individuals' ability to perform those roles. And this may mean that the UN is oftentimes very inefficient and perhaps not the best decision-making processes in terms of utility maximization are employed. And lastly, lots of folks have criticized the, and I'm quoting, bloated and inefficient, unquote, UN bureaucracy. And respondents to these criticisms have said, look, the budget's only $1.2 billion annually. That's pretty small. It's only 1/4 the size of the New York City municipal budget. The UN only employs about 50,000 persons, and that's about the size of what it takes to run the city of Stockholm, Sweden. And then people say, these respondents to the criticisms of the UN, and look at how much the UN gets done. Look at all those numerous social and economic programs out there. Look at how many lives they've been saving. But again, I suggest that the average citizen in the developed world knows precious little about those success stories, and that it would behoove these folks who think that the UN is a worthy, important, relevant international entity to tell us more about those success stories. Because, of course, the media tends to only focus on the failures. Right? And it might behoove us as individuals to learn more about those success stories than to just listen to what the media wants to tell us. The former Prime Minister of Sweden, Ingvar Carlsson, wrote an article in 1995. It's a very interesting article. I'm contemplating having those of you in my class read it this week. And he laid out a whole series of reforms for what we should do at the United Nations. And he said we needed to fix the Security Council, we needed to create an Economic Security Council, we needed to reformulate the Trusteeship Council, we needed to fix various aspects of the General Assembly. He wanted to promote the role of civil society, non-governmental organizations, and private persons in the functioning of the UN. And he wanted to reform the Secretariat and the Secretary General, too. And I went back through. He wrote that article in 1995, it's now 2003, and I couldn't find a single one of those reforms that had actually been implemented. Not a single one. Now, I might have missed a few, but I don't think so. And that was a bit disheartening, because he'd laid out a very interesting plan, but one that never came to fruition, even in part. Kofi Annan has said that we have many problems in this world this day. These are problems without passports. That's a quote. And what he means by that is that for some of today's global concerns, borders are largely meaningless, and we need an international body to deal with these dilemmas. And again, he argues that the international community does exist. It has an address. That address is in New York City, and the name of that community is the United Nations. And he talks very much about the good that the UN has done. But again, I'm not sure we are all very much aware of what the UN has done in terms of those success stories. Jeane Kirkpatrick, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, has pointed out that actually there's a very big lack of representation and democratic accountability in UN decision-making. And she suggests that the inefficient, slow decision-making can be very harmful to countries in need of immediate assistance or protection. And she suggests that Bosnia, Rwanda, and even Kosovo, an event to which the UN came rather late to the table, approving of NATO action in Kosovo after it had already taken place, that areas such as this can't wait around for the inefficient UN to do its job. And her idea is that in sum, neither war by committee nor peace by committee works particularly well. Some issues, according to Jeane Kirkpatrick, are better left to the states most immediately involved and the relevant major powers outside of the UN or Security Council setting. So in conclusion, a phrase my students always love to hear, I'd like to leave you with two rather diverse views about the UN, its role in the world today, and the relationship between the UN and the United States. The first is from one of the founders of the United Nations, a gentleman by the name of Gladwin Jebb from the United Kingdom. And he's writing at the time when they're trying to persuade other countries to sign on, to join this new body. And he's just lived through the horrors of World War II, and he never wants to see that happen again. And he says, "It is essential to have some place in which reason or law can be brought to bear on conflicts, either for preventing them or for ending them in accordance with certain generally accepted rules. We must not despair if these rules are often violated or more frequently ignored, or even if the superpowers sometimes fail to make use of the machinery altogether. The great thing is that it should be there, and when the abyss really yawns before those powers, I believe that at that time, it is to the United Nations that those nations will turn." Contrast that with an op-ed piece from The Economist from this past March. "This war is being fought without UN approval, yet the UN does not, despite predictions, look irrelevant. On the contrary, it looks like an arena in which, among other things, many future efforts to constrain or steer American power will be played out. The UN will have to adapt. It will have to yield on occasion to America. But America cannot run the world on its own. If the UN did not exist, it would have to be invented. Today, as last time, much of the task would fall to the Americans." Thank you all for listening.